While the world celebrated Michael Jordan as basketball's greatest winner, Juanita Vanoy was quietly losing the man she loved through every missed dinner, every empty chair, and every unspoken goodbye, until she realized that saving her children and herself meant finally stepping out of the shadow of his greatness. Juanita Vanoy stood by the tall window in the Chicago hotel suite, looking down at the city lights that stretched out forever below. It had been almost 20 years since she last opened up like this, but something inside her finally said yes to this special interview. This was the same city where her love story with Michael had started all those years ago, full of hope and young dreams. Now, it was also the place where their marriage had quietly come to an end. The memories felt so close she could almost touch them, the snowy nights, the laughter that slowly faded, and the empty chairs at the dinner table. She took a slow breath and sat down across from Elena Ramirez, the journalist who had waited patiently for this moment. Elena gave her a kind look, the kind that said she understood this wasn't easy. The recorder was running softly between them. After some gentle small talk about how Chicago still felt like home, Elena asked the question everyone had wondered about for so long. After everything you lost, do you ever wish you hadn't left your marriage? The words landed heavy in the quiet room. Juanita didn't jump in with an answer. She let the silence sit there for a while, her hands resting in her lap as old feelings washed over her. The love, the pain, the years of trying to hold everything together while raising the kids mostly on her own. It all came rushing back. Instead of speaking right away, Juanita reached down into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. It was simple and worn from years of being picked up and put away again. She held it for a second like it was something fragile, then opened the lid. Inside lay the things she had never been able to let go of. A pair of tiny baby socks so small they barely covered her fingertip, a faded hospital bracelet with the date still visible, and a letter folded carefully that she had written but never sent. Looking at them now brought a lump to her throat. These little items told a story no one else really knew, a private heartbreak that had changed everything for her. Juanita's voice came out soft and honest when she finally spoke. To understand why I left, you need to know about someone who never had a chance to call us Mom and Dad. Her eyes misted over as she said it, and for a moment the room felt even quieter. It wasn't just about the fame or the basketball schedule or the way Michael's world had pulled him away. It was about this tiny life that came and went too soon, about the way it left a hole that made all the other cracks in their marriage impossible to ignore. She thought about the nights she had sat alone, wondering if things could have been different, if one more conversation or one more moment together might have changed the path they took. Elena listened with real care, giving her all the time she needed. Juanita felt a mix of sadness and relief, sharing even this much. It had been locked inside for so long. Right then, as the weight of those memories settled between them, Juanita's phone buzzed gently on the table. She glanced down at the screen. It was Michael. For years, she had answered before she was ready, afraid that silence might widen the distance between them. This time, she turned the phone face down. The story had waited nearly 20 years to be told. The call could wait a little longer. It was a cold, snowy night in 1985 when Juanita Vanoy finally let her friend drag her out of the house. She was working 2 jobs just to keep up with rent and bills, barely getting any sleep, and the last thing she felt like doing was going out. But her friend kept pushing, saying she needed a break from the grind. They ended up at a small gathering in the city, nothing fancy, just people talking and laughing over warm drinks while the snow fell outside. That's where she first saw him, Michael Jordan. He was young, still a little shy, standing tall with those enormous hands that looked like they could hold the whole world. He didn't try to stand out or show off. He just smiled quietly when their eyes met. They started talking in a corner, away from the noise, and right away, Juanita noticed something different about him. Most guys his age would brag about what they were doing or what they wanted to achieve. Not Michael. He spoke softly about his parents, about the lessons they taught him, and about the times he had failed and how much those moments still stung. He opened up about his deep fear of being forgotten, like his hard work might not leave any real mark. Juanita listened closely, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Here was this young man carrying such heavy thoughts, and he trusted her enough to share them on their very first real conversation. It made her see him in a way that felt special, like she was getting a peek at the heart behind the quiet smile. "I don't fear losing a game," Michael said, his voice low and honest. "I fear being forgotten." Juanita tilted her head, surprised by how serious he sounded for someone so young. "You're young and already worried about being forgotten?" "Maybe that's why I have to run faster than everyone else," he replied, a small determined smile crossing his face. Those words stuck with her. There was something vulnerable in the way he said it, but also a fire that made her heart beat a little quicker. She could tell he wasn't just talking about basketball. He was talking about life, about wanting to matter in a way that lasted. For the first time in a long while, Juanita felt truly seen too, like he was really listening when she shared bits of her own struggles with work and dreams that sometimes felt out of reach. Later in the night, someone brought up the team that had beaten Michael's squad recently. His whole expression changed in an instant. The shy, gentle guy she had been talking to disappeared. His eyes grew sharp and cold, his jaw tightened, and there was a look there that said he would never accept second place. Juanita saw a different man in that moment, one who was relentless, driven by something deep inside that wouldn't let him rest. It surprised her, but it also pulled her in. She could feel the intensity coming off him, the kind of drive most people only dream about. It made her wonder what it would be like to stand beside someone like that, someone who burned so brightly. As the evening wound down and the snow kept falling outside, Michael looked at her with those honest eyes. He confessed that basketball would always come first in his life. The words were simple, but they carried a quiet warning. Juanita felt a small tug in her heart, a mix of excitement and something like worry. She liked this guy, the real him, not the future star everyone else might see someday. But she also sensed that loving him might mean learning to share him with a dream that was bigger than both of them. Still, as they said goodbye that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that this snowy meeting was the start of something she would never forget. Those early days with Michael felt like stolen pieces of normal life that Juanita treasured more than anything. They would meet in quiet spots around Chicago where the cameras and the noise couldn't find them. Long walks by the lake became their favorite thing, holding hands while the wind blew off the water and they talked about everything and nothing at all. Sometimes they ducked into small neighborhood restaurants, sharing plates of warm food and laughing over little stories from their days. Juanita told him about the struggles of balancing two jobs and dreaming of a steadier future. Michael opened up more about his family, his drive to make them proud, and the pressure he put on himself. In those moments, he wasn't the rising basketball star everyone else saw. He was just Michael, thoughtful, a little unsure, and genuinely interested in her world. Those simple times made her heart feel full in a way she hadn't known before. One snowy night, everything felt a little more real. Juanita's old car broke down on a quiet street, the engine giving out in the cold. She called Michael, not expecting much because she knew he had a personal practice scheduled. But he showed up anyway, skipping the session without hesitation. He rolled up his sleeves in the falling snow and worked on the car until it started again, his big hands moving carefully under the hood. Juanita watched him from the side, her heart swelling with warmth. In that moment, she felt like she mattered more than basketball, more than the game that seemed to pull at him every single day. It was such a small thing, but it gave her so much hope. Maybe love really could find a way to balance everything. When the car was finally running, they sat inside together, the heater slowly warming up the space. Michael looked over at her, snow still melting in his hair. "Tonight I came for you," he said quietly. "But someday a game may call me. I'm not sure I'll choose you." His words were honest, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that settled deep in her chest. Juanita reached for his hand and held it tight. "When you love someone, you'll learn to return," she told him, believing it with everything she had. She wanted so badly for that to be true, for their connection to be strong enough to bring him back home every time. Michael gazed out the window at the falling snow, his face thoughtful and a little distant. "I only know how to move forward," he said softly. The silence after that felt heavy, but Juanita pushed the worry aside. She saw the man who had come for her on a cold night when he didn't have to. She saw the way he listened to her dreams and shared his own fears. In her heart, she truly believed that love could change him, that over time he would find a way to balance the court and the life they were building together. It was a sweet mistake, one she held on to tightly because the hope felt so good. She didn't realize yet that he had already shown her the truth of their future, that his drive would always push him forward, sometimes leaving her waiting in the snow. But for now, in the warm car with his hand in hers, she chose to believe in the love they had right then. And that was enough to keep her heart full. The wedding was nothing like the big fairy tales people dream about. It happened in a small, simple chapel with just a handful of family members there to witness it. No huge crowd, no fancy decorations, just the quiet warmth of people who truly cared. Their first child was waiting back at home with a relative, already part of this new chapter before it even started. Juanita stood there in a modest dress, looking at Michael and feeling a deep mix of joy and nerves. Life wasn't perfect, they both knew that, but in that moment, it felt like they were choosing each other anyway. The air smelled of old wood and fresh flowers, and the soft light coming through the windows made everything feel intimate and real. This was their start, not glamorous, but honest. Before they exchanged rings, Juanita took Michael's hands and looked straight into his eyes. She wanted him to hear her heart clearly. "I don't need you to abandon your dream," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I just need you not to let applause drown out our children." The words came from all the quiet hopes she carried for their family. She knew his talent was special, that the world was starting to notice him, but she needed him to remember the little life they were building at home too. Michael listened closely, his big hands gently holding hers. There was a seriousness in his face that showed he understood what she was asking. "Even as the world pulls me away," he replied, his voice low and sincere, "I will know the way home." Those words wrapped around her like a promise she could hold on to. In that small chapel, with their family watching quietly, it felt like they were making a real commitment, not just to marriage, but to trying to make space for each other no matter what came next. They slipped the rings on, simple bands that meant everything in that moment. The ceremony was short and heartfelt, ending with soft applause from the few people there. Juanita felt a quiet happiness settle in her chest as they walked out together. This was their life now, and she believed they could figure it out one day at a time. After the wedding, their days took on a new rhythm. Michael poured everything into building a dynasty on the basketball court, chasing wins and glory that the whole world could see. Practices, games, travel, it all pulled him in deeper. At the same time, Juanita focused on building their family, handling the everyday things that kept their home running. She cared for their child, made sure meals were on the table, and created the kind of warmth that made a house feel safe. She handled the doctor visits, the bedtime stories, and the quiet moments when worries crept in. Michael's success was bright and loud, splashed across newspapers and TV screens for everyone to cheer. Juanita's work was quieter, happening behind closed doors, but it was just as important. Only one of those worlds got the attention, though. She often reminded herself of the promise they made in that tiny chapel, hoping the applause wouldn't drown out what really mattered most. For now, she held on to the love they shared, and the belief that they were in this together, building something lasting in their own ways. The early championship years came fast and hard. Michael was winning almost everything, bringing home trophies that made headlines and filled the living room with celebrations the whole city seemed to join. Juanita was happy for him, she really was, but her days looked completely different. She juggled two little ones, feeding them, rocking them through the night, and answering phone calls from people who always wanted a piece of Michael. The house felt busy and full, yet lonely at the same time. She would watch the games on TV with the kids when she could, cheering along while trying to keep the bottles warm and the diapers changed. Michael would call when he had a moment, his voice tired but excited, telling her about the wins. She supported him with all her heart, but deep down, she felt the weight of holding everything together back home while he chased greatness on the court. At dinner time, they always set 4 chairs around the table. Jeffrey, their oldest, made sure to pull out the extra one for his dad every single evening. It became a little ritual for him, a way to keep hoping his father would walk through the door. One tired night, after another long day of managing the kids alone, Juanita started to clear that empty chair away to make more space. She was exhausted, and the sight of it sitting there unused hurt more than she wanted to admit. Before she could move it, Jeffrey looked up at her with those big, trusting eyes. "Keep it, Mom," he said softly. "Maybe tonight Dad will remember." His words hit her right in the chest. She left the chair exactly where it was, swallowing the lump in her throat and forcing a small smile for her son. That empty seat became a symbol of everything they were missing, night after night. When the kids asked where their dad was, Juanita started telling the first of many little lies. "He's busy with work, sweetheart. He loves you and he'll be home when he can." The words came out easy enough on the outside, but inside they felt heavy. She knew the truth. A chair at the table couldn't fill the space their father left behind. It couldn't replace the bedtime stories he missed, or the way the kids' faces lit up when he actually walked in the door. She would tuck them in later, whispering goodnight and trying to make up for the absence with extra hugs and kisses. Her love for Michael was still there, but so was the growing ache of doing this family thing mostly on her own. She kept believing things would balance out eventually, but the empty chair reminded her every evening how far apart their worlds were becoming. After one big championship win, the phone rang late. Michael's voice was full of the thrill of victory on the other end. Juanita congratulated him warmly, letting the kids listen for a moment. But once the call ended, Jeffrey looked up at her with a drawing he had made earlier that day. "Mom," he asked quietly, "did Dad ever see the picture I made for him?" The simple question broke something inside her. She pulled her son close, holding back tears as she told him how proud his dad would be. In her heart, though, she felt the growing distance more clearly than ever. The wins kept coming for Michael, but back home, the empty chair and unanswered little hopes were starting to leave marks that no trophy could fix. One ordinary afternoon, the phone rang while Juanita was folding laundry. It was Jeffrey's teacher, her voice gentle but serious. She told Juanita that her son had drawn a special picture in class that day. In the family portrait, everyone was there smiling together, except for his dad. Michael was drawn standing outside the frame on a TV screen, like he belonged more to the world than to their home. Juanita listened quietly, her heart sinking as the teacher described it. She thanked her and hung up, but the image stayed burned in her mind. She could picture Jeffrey sitting there at his desk, carefully coloring in his father far away on that screen. It hurt more than she expected, like a quiet reminder of how their days were slipping by. Later that evening, when Jeffrey came home, Juanita sat with him and asked about the drawing. He looked down at his shoes for a moment before answering. "Dad is on TV more than at home," he said simply, his young voice carrying a sadness that no child should have to feel. Those words landed heavy on her. She hugged him tight, trying to comfort him, but inside she felt something shift. The teacher had also shared something that stayed with Juanita long after the call. "Children don't draw what they are told," she had said kindly. "They draw what they feel." It was one of those moments that woke her up. All the little absences were adding up, and her kids were feeling it deep down, even if they didn't always say it out loud. She realized she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. That night, after the kids were asleep, Juanita took the drawing and carefully placed it inside her small wooden box. She hid it away with the other quiet keepsakes she had collected over the years. She never showed it to Michael. He had a major game coming up, and she didn't want to upset him or add any extra weight to his shoulders right before he stepped on the court. Part of her hoped that keeping this pain to herself would protect their family somehow. She sat alone in the quiet house, holding the box on her lap, thinking about how different their realities had become. Michael was out there shining under the bright lights, while she was here trying to hold their children's hearts together. Over the next few days, Juanita started noticing small changes in her kids. They stopped asking quite so often when Dad was coming home. They seemed to be learning to go about their days without expecting him to show up for every little thing. It broke her heart to see it, but she understood. Her children had started accepting the absence in their own quiet way, finding ways to be okay even when he wasn't there. She wondered how long they could keep going like this. And for the first time, a deeper worry settled in her chest. The family portrait without a father wasn't just a drawing anymore. It was starting to feel like the picture of their everyday life. The news of James Jordan's death struck their home like a storm no one had seen coming. To Michael, his father had always seemed unshakable, the man whose approval mattered more than applause and whose voice could reach him even through the noise of an arena. When James was gone, the man the world believed could overcome anything became quiet and unreachable. Juanita watched grief settle over her husband, changing the way he moved through the house and the way he looked at the people who loved him. She tried to meet him inside that grief. On difficult nights, she wrapped her arms around him and reminded him that he did not have to carry the loss alone. But Michael rarely leaned back. His body stayed rigid, as if accepting comfort would force him to admit how badly he was hurting. The hugs that should have brought them closer often left Juanita standing beside him with her arms full of a sorrow he would not share. Then, Michael stepped away from basketball and turned toward baseball, a game tied in his mind to his father. The public saw courage in the decision, a son honoring a dream they had once discussed. Juanita saw that too. But she also saw a man running because stopping felt unbearable. He threw himself into batting practice, road trips, and a new set of expectations. The uniform changed, but the pattern did not. Pain became another opponent he believed he could defeat by moving faster. One evening, after the children were asleep, Juanita found him sitting alone in the dark. She told him he did not have to win against grief. Michael stared ahead for a long time before admitting that if he stopped moving, the loss might finally catch him. The answer broke her heart because it revealed how frightened he was and how little room he had left for anyone to reach him. During the lonely nights that followed, Juanita began recording messages on a small tape player. She spoke about the children, the house, and the husband she missed even when he was only a few rooms away. She told him that grief did not have to be faced alone. But she never played the tapes for him. She kept them hidden, afraid that asking him to listen would feel like one more demand placed on a man already carrying too much. Juanita still loved the man she had married. Yet for the first time, she understood that love could stand beside someone's pain without being allowed inside it. James's death had not created every distance between them, but it deepened the silence until husband and wife began grieving in separate rooms. When Michael returned to the NBA in 1995, The world celebrated as though a missing piece had been restored. Arenas filled, cameras flashed, and Chicago welcomed him back with a devotion that seemed almost larger than the game itself. Juanita felt proud watching him rediscover the part of himself that had always looked most alive. But beneath that pride was a quieter fear. The man had returned to basketball, yet the father his children were waiting for still seemed far away. The schedule filled again with practices, flights, appearances, and games that carried the expectations of an entire city. At home, Juanita continued managing the rhythm of childhood: school mornings, doctor visits, homework, birthdays, and the small emergencies that never appeared on television. Michael called when he could. He loved the children. She never doubted that. But love often arrived through a telephone line after the moment that needed it had already passed. As Jasmine grew older, she began noticing the difference between the father on television and the man who sometimes sat silently at their table. On screen, he laughed with teammates and lifted his arms toward roaring crowds. At home, exhaustion followed him from room to room. One evening, after watching him smile through a post-game interview, Jasmine looked at Juanita and wondered why her father seemed to save his brightest smile for strangers. Juanita pulled her daughter close, unable to offer an answer that would not hurt. The children slowly created their own way of surviving disappointment. They stopped saving every small story for Michael. A good grade, a funny moment at school, or a drawing they were proud of was shared with Juanita first. It was not punishment, it was protection. They were learning that hope hurt less when it was kept small. One afternoon, Juanita overheard them agreeing not to bother their father because he was always busy. She stood outside the room and pressed a hand against the wall, steadying herself. Her children were not angry. That was what frightened her most. They were adapting. The world believed Michael Jordan had returned completely. Juanita knew better. The competitor had come back. The husband and father were still trying to find the way home. As Michael's face appeared everywhere, on television screens, billboards, magazine covers, and shoes worn by children around the world, Juanita became determined to keep one place untouched by it. Their home would not become another arena. There would be no cheering crowds in the kitchen, no reporters near the children's bedrooms, and no special rules simply because their father could fly through the air with a basketball in his hands. At home, shoes were left by the door, homework came before television, and every child was expected to clear a plate from the dinner table. Michael might belong partly to the world, but Jeffrey, Marcus, and Jasmine still deserved a childhood that belonged to them. Juanita drove them to school whenever she could and made sure they spent time with cousins and relatives who knew them as children, not as heirs to a famous name. She wanted them to understand the neighborhoods their family had come from and to know that life did not always arrive in private cars or behind guarded gates. Sometimes other parents stared when she walked into a school hallway. Sometimes children whispered when one of the Jordan kids entered a classroom. Juanita noticed every glance, but she refused to let her children believe those looks made them more important than anyone else. One afternoon, Jeffrey came home unusually quiet. Another student had asked why he did not act more like Michael Jordan's son. Jeffrey did not know what that was supposed to mean. He placed his backpack on the floor and asked whether he was expected to be different. Juanita sat beside him and took his hand. She reminded him that the world might know his father's number, but it did not get to decide who he would become. Jeffrey carried his backpack upstairs a little straighter than before. That evening, cameras waited beyond the gate, hoping for a glimpse of the family. Their flashes appeared between the trees like distant lightning. Inside, Juanita closed the curtains and called the children to dinner. Marcus complained about vegetables. Jasmine laughed with her mouth full. Jeffrey insisted that he had finished homework he had barely started. For a few precious minutes, they were not the family of the most famous athlete alive. They were simply a mother and 3 children talking over one another at the table. Juanita looked at the empty chair where Michael should have been and felt the familiar ache. But that night she understood something important. She was not merely waiting for a man to return, she was guarding the childhood of the people he loved most. Every ordinary dinner, every school morning, and every visit with family was a small wall she built between her children and a world that wanted to turn them into part of their father's legend. The applause could have Michael. She would make sure it did not take the children, too. The school auditorium was crowded with parents on the night of Marcus's performance. He had practiced for weeks, repeating his lines at breakfast and whispering them to himself before bed. Michael had promised he would be there. Juanita arrived early with Jeffrey and Jasmine and left the seat beside her empty, believing until the last possible moment that he would slip through the door. The lights dimmed. Marcus stepped onto the stage and found his mother in the audience. His voice shook during the first line, then steadied when Juanita smiled. She clapped after every scene, sometimes glancing toward the entrance. The seat beside her remained empty. When the final curtain fell, the room rose in applause. Marcus bowed with the other children, but his eyes moved across the audience, searching for someone who was not there. Backstage, he ran into Juanita's arms. She told him how proud she was and how well he had done. Marcus held onto her for a moment, then asked her to clap for Dad too. Juanita returned to the nearly empty auditorium with him. She stood beneath the fading stage lights and applauded again, once for herself and once for the father who had missed it. She clapped until her palms stung, pouring into that sound all the love she wished could have filled the empty seat. Marcus smiled, but the smile carried an understanding that made him look older than he was. Michael called later that night. His voice was warm but rushed as he asked how Marcus had done. Juanita looked down at her reddened hands and described every detail: the costume, the first nervous line, the way their son had found his courage. She did not tell Michael that Marcus had searched the room for him. She did not tell him that the performance had been repeated for an audience of one. After the call, Juanita stood outside Marcus's bedroom and listened to his breathing. She wondered how many times a child could turn absence into imagination before the heart stopped expecting anyone to arrive. That night, she had managed to fill the auditorium with applause. She could not fill the chair. On June 11, 1997, Michael was hundreds of miles from home in Salt Lake City, preparing for one of the biggest games of his life while battling a severe illness. When he called from the team hotel, Juanita could hear the weakness in his voice. She urged him to protect his body, but she already knew the answer. The team needed him, the championship was at stake, and Michael had built his life around never stepping away when the world expected him to compete. That same evening in Chicago, Jasmine developed a fever of her own. She lay restless beneath a thin blanket, her cheeks hot and her small hands searching for her mother. Juanita moved between the bathroom and the bedroom with cool cloths, medicine, and water. The television remained on in the next room, carrying the sound of the arena into a house where another child was fighting a much smaller, quieter battle. Juanita sat beside Jasmine and watched the game from the bedroom doorway. On screen, Michael looked exhausted, but he kept moving. Every basket brought the crowd to its feet. Every time he bent over with his hands on his knees, Juanita felt fear tighten in her chest. She was proud of him and angry with him at the same time. Proud that he could give so much, angry that the world always seemed to receive the strongest part of him. Late in the game, Michael made the plays that helped Chicago win. His name echoed through the arena as teammates held him upright. Back in the bedroom, Jasmine opened her eyes and asked whether her father knew that she was trying too. Juanita swallowed the tears rising in her throat. She kissed her daughter's forehead and promised that Michael would be proud. But after Jasmine fell asleep, Juanita sat alone between the glowing television and the child's darkened room, thinking about the two fevers that had defined the night. One would become part of basketball history. The other would disappear by morning, remembered only by a mother and a little girl who had wanted her father to know she had been brave. By the time Michael returned to Chicago, Jasmine's fever had broken. The headlines celebrated one of his greatest victories. Juanita smiled when he walked through the door, but she carried their daughter's question in silence. Behind a public triumph, another small family moment had passed without him. When Michael retired for the second time in 1999, Juanita allowed herself to feel hope again. No more long road trips, no more practices that stretched into family evenings, no more seasons measured by how many moments the children had lost. She imagined school events attended from the beginning, ordinary breakfasts, and dinners where no chair had to be saved. The reality was different. Without the game that had defined him, Michael seemed restless and displaced. He wandered through the large house as though he could not locate the person he had been outside an arena. He became impatient over small things and spent long hours alone. Juanita planned family outings, invited him into the routines he had missed, and gave him space when closeness seemed to irritate him. Yet the man she had waited for did not simply return when basketball ended. Marcus began marking a calendar in his room. On every day his father was truly present, not merely inside the house, but listening, laughing, and staying. He made a small mark. Juanita found the calendar while putting away laundry. Weeks of blank squares surrounded a handful of marks. She sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the page until the numbers blurred. One evening, she prepared Michael's favorite meal. The children helped set the table, their hope carefully hidden beneath casual conversation. They waited until the food began to cool. Eventually, Jeffrey reached for his fork. Marcus followed. Jasmine did not ask where her father was. No one suggested waiting 5 more minutes. Juanita watched them begin dinner without disappointment, because disappointment had become familiar. The meal she had spent hours preparing tasted like nothing. The house was larger than anything she had imagined when she and Michael were young, yet somehow there was no room inside it where all 5 of them could remain together. That night, after the kitchen was clean and the children were asleep, Juanita considered divorce without immediately feeling guilty. The thought did not arrive as anger. It came as exhaustion and as a quiet responsibility to stop teaching her children that love meant waiting forever for someone who might never fully return. By 2001, much of the hope Juanita had carried since Michael's retirement had faded. Life without the Bulls had not brought him closer to the family. Instead, retirement seemed to make him restless, as though silence itself had become an opponent. Then basketball began calling again, first through meetings, business decisions, and trips connected to the Washington Wizards, and eventually through the possibility of wearing a uniform once more. Juanita recognized the change before Michael announced it. His voice sharpened when he discussed players. Games filled his thoughts. At dinner, his eyes sometimes followed an invisible scoreboard beyond the room. The old intensity had returned, and with it came the familiar sense that everything else would soon be asked to move aside. When he decided to return as a player, a suitcase appeared near the front door. Juanita stood looking at it after the children had gone upstairs. It was not a large suitcase, but it seemed to occupy the entire hallway. She remembered the small chapel, the promise that he would always know the way home, and the years she had spent believing retirement would finally bring him back for good. She asked how long he would be in Washington. Michael looked toward the suitcase before admitting that he did not know. It was not a cruel answer. That almost made it worse. He was not leaving because he no longer loved them. He was leaving because the part of him that needed to compete had begun breathing again, and once it awakened, everything else had to make room. The children received the news differently. Jeffrey tried to understand it like an adult. Marcus wondered how strange the Wizards' uniform would look. Jasmine asked whether Washington was farther away than the cities where he had played before. Juanita answered carefully. She did not tell them that distance was measured in more than miles. A person could sit across from you and remain unreachable. An entire family could live inside a man's heart and still come second to the thing that made him feel most alive. On the morning Michael left, the children hugged him near the door. He promised to call and told them he loved them. Juanita believed both things. She watched the car disappear beyond the gate and remained there after the road was empty. Years earlier, she had feared basketball would take her husband away. Now she understood that basketball did not have to take him. Michael kept choosing to follow it. Retirement had not ended their waiting. It had only given the family a brief intermission before the game began again. Juanita finally took the step she had been thinking about for a long time. She filed the divorce papers quietly, her hands shaking a little as she signed them. It wasn't an easy choice, but after years of trying to hold everything together, it felt like the only way to give her children and herself a chance at peace. When Michael found out, the shock hit him hard. He stood in the living room holding the papers, his face full of disbelief. "We never had a fight big enough to end this," he said, his voice cracking with confusion and hurt. Juanita looked at him, her eyes tired but clear. "Not shouts," she replied softly, "but years without words killed us." The truth of those words hung between them, heavy with all the missed dinners, silent nights, and empty chairs. It wasn't one big blow-up that broke them. It was the slow, quiet drifting apart that had worn their marriage down until there was nothing left to hold on to. The children felt the change in the air right away. Jasmine took it the hardest. One afternoon, Juanita found her sitting on the floor with a paper family figure she had made, the kind with stick arms and big smiles. In frustration and sadness, Jasmine tore it right down the middle, her small hands shaking as tears rolled down her cheeks. The sound of the paper ripping broke Juanita's heart more than anything. She knelt beside her daughter and pulled her into a tight hug, letting her cry it out while whispering that none of this was her fault. Marcus stayed quieter, but his eyes looked sad in a way that no child should. The whole house felt different now, like the family they had tried so hard to keep together was coming apart in pieces, just like that torn paper figure. Later that evening, the kids did something that touched Juanita deeply. They took the torn pieces, carefully taped them back together, and left the mended family figure by the bedroom door with a little note. It was their unspoken plea, a silent way of asking their parents to try one more time. Juanita picked it up and held it for a long while, tears filling her eyes as she traced the tape lines with her finger. She realized in that moment how much she had been protecting their feelings all these years, softening the absences and delaying the hard decisions to keep them from hurting. Seeing that taped-up figure made her question everything again. Part of her still wanted to fix things for the kids' sake, but another part knew that staying might only teach them to live with the same emptiness she had carried for so long. She placed the paper figure gently on the table, her heart torn between the love she still felt and the need to finally let go. The divorce petition became public before Juanita had time to understand what she had done. Reporters gathered outside the gates. Her name appeared in headlines beside words like property, custody, and irreconcilable differences. Strangers discussed the end of her marriage as if it were another game to be analyzed, with winners, losers, and numbers arranged beneath their names. Inside the house, there was no scoreboard. There were only 3 children watching their parents carefully. Michael did not respond with anger. The shock on his face was quieter than that. For the first time in years, Juanita saw him look frightened by something he could not defeat through effort. He could study an opponent, train harder, or take the final shot. But there was no practice drill for discovering that the person who had waited for you no longer believed waiting would change anything. During the weeks that followed, they began speaking again, not through assistants, schedules, or messages passed through the children, but directly. Some conversations ended in silence, others lasted until morning. They talked about the first snowy nights in Chicago, the small chapel in Las Vegas, and the children who had grown while their marriage slowly disappeared behind Michael's career. Neither of them could identify one moment when everything had broken. There had been no single betrayal large enough to explain it. Their marriage had been worn down by thousands of smaller departures. Then, 1 month after filing, Juanita withdrew the petition. She did not do it because the pain had vanished. She did it because nearly 17 years of shared history could not be signed away in a lawyer's office. Michael asked for another chance, and somewhere beneath her exhaustion, Juanita found one last piece of hope she had not yet spent. They agreed to try again, not for the cameras, not for the money, and not simply because the children had taped a paper family back together. They would try because once, before the championships and empty chairs, they had loved each other without needing to be reminded how. For a short time, effort returned to the house. Michael came to breakfast without a telephone in his hand. They took the children out together. One evening, he arrived home early enough to sit through an entire dinner, listening as Jasmine described her day and Marcus argued with Jeffrey about something neither parent fully understood. Juanita watched Michael laugh with them and felt the dangerous warmth of hope spreading through her again. This, she thought, was the man she had been waiting for. But reconciliation could not be built from exceptional days. It had to survive ordinary ones. Gradually, old patterns returned. Calls interrupted meals. Trips grew longer. Conversations were postponed until both of them were too tired to begin them. Michael was making an effort, but effort for him often arrived like one of his great performances, intense, determined, and impossible to sustain every night. Juanita did not doubt that he loved his family. What she doubted was whether love could become presence after so many years of absence. One evening, she opened the drawer where she kept copies of the legal papers. The withdrawal document lay on top. She ran her fingers across the date and realized that taking back a divorce petition was not the same as taking back all the loneliness that had led her to file it. Still, she did not regret trying. The month had given them something important. It removed the question of whether they had surrendered too quickly. In the years that followed, whenever guilt whispered that she should have stayed longer or forgiven more, Juanita remembered those 30 days. They had turned toward each other one last time. They had reached across the distance with everything they had left, and even then, their hands had not been able to hold. Life in the fragile months after Juanita withdrew the divorce petition felt like walking through a storm that had briefly gone quiet but had never truly passed. In the middle of paperwork, lawyers, and painful conversations, Juanita discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a rush of joy that surprised her. Another baby. A new life that felt like a small light in all the darkness they had been living through. She placed her hand on her belly and allowed herself a few quiet moments of hope, imagining what it might be like to hold this child and start fresh. But right behind the joy came a wave of fear that crashed over her. Everything with Michael still felt uncertain. How could she bring a baby into a home that was already breaking? The timing felt impossible, and the weight of it all left her sitting alone in the bedroom, tears mixing with that complicated happiness. She thought about calling Michael many times. Her hand would hover over the phone, but she could never quite make the call. She hesitated because she knew him. Part of her feared he would see this as a reason to try fixing what was already broken between them, pulling them back into the same cycle of hope and disappointment. Juanita wanted to protect this little life and her own heart from more pain. So the calls stayed unmade. She carried the secret quietly, talking to the baby in soft whispers when the house was empty, sharing her worries and her dreams like the child could somehow understand. Those private moments became her way of holding on, even as their reconciliation moved forward and her emotions swung between excitement and deep uncertainty. 8 weeks later, the joy slipped away in silence. Juanita started bleeding and knew right away what was happening. She drove herself to the hospital, choosing to go through the loss alone rather than reach out for support that might complicate everything even more. The pain was both physical and emotional, a deep ache that settled in her chest as the doctors confirmed the miscarriage. She lay there in the quiet room, feeling the empty space where that small hope had been. It wasn't just the baby she mourned. It was the idea of a fresh start, the chance to do things differently, and the love that never got to grow. She kept it all inside, breathing through the waves of grief by herself. When it was over, a kind nurse sat with her and asked gently, "Is there someone you'd like me to call?" Juanita looked at the woman through tired eyes and whispered, "No one." The words felt final and lonely, but they were honest. In that moment, she realized she had to face this particular pain on her own, protecting what was left of her strength for the children who were still waiting at home. The fourth child, the one who never got to stay, became another quiet secret she carried in her heart. Juanita came home from the hospital carrying a pain she couldn't name out loud. She told the children she was just feeling ill and needed to rest for a few days. They didn't know about the baby she had lost, and she wanted to keep it that way. The last thing she wanted was to add more sadness to their already heavy hearts during their fragile reconciliation. So she smiled through the exhaustion and let them believe it was nothing serious. Inside, though, the grief sat deep and quiet. She moved slowly around the house, her body and spirit both worn down from the silent loss. The empty feeling followed her everywhere, a reminder of the little life that had come and gone too quickly. Even in their own confusion and hurt, the children stepped up in the sweetest ways. Jeffrey, always the thoughtful one, brought her a bowl of warm soup he had helped make in the kitchen. He carried it carefully to her bedside, his young hands steady as he set it down. "Here, Mom. This will help you feel better," he said softly, staying close until she took a few spoonfuls. His quiet care wrapped around her like a hug she didn't know she needed so badly. Marcus came in next with a bright drawing of a big yellow sun shining over their house. He handed it to her with a serious little face and said, "Don't be sad, Mom." Those simple words in the cheerful sun on the paper brought fresh tears to her eyes. She pulled him close and thanked him, holding the drawing like it was the most precious thing in the world. Jasmine, her sensitive girl, showed her love in the gentlest way. She crawled into bed beside Juanita without being asked, snuggling up close under the covers. Then she picked up one of her favorite storybooks and started reading aloud in her soft, sweet voice. The stories filled the quiet room, taking Juanita's mind off the pain for a little while as she listened to her daughter's words. Jasmine read page after page, occasionally glancing up to make sure her mom was okay. Those three gifts, the soup, the sunny drawing, and the bedtime stories, meant more to Juanita than she could ever say. In the middle of her grief, her children were caring for her the way she had always tried to care for them. Their love felt like a light that kept her going when everything else felt dark. Later, when the house grew still, Juanita opened her small wooden box again. She carefully placed the tiny baby socks, the hospital bracelet, and the children's drawings inside. With them, she added a letter she had written through her tears. "You were 8 weeks, it said, enough to teach me that a child shouldn't be born to save parents." She folded the letter gently and closed the box, holding it close to her chest for a long moment. The children's kindness had given her strength, but this private grief was hers to carry alone. She tucked the box away, grateful for the love surrounding her, even as her heart quietly mourned what could have been. Juanita had reached a point where she needed real wisdom from someone who had lived through the same world. She called Michael's mother, Dolores, and they arranged to meet on a calm afternoon, away from the noise of the city. When they sat down together, Dolores looked at her with eyes full of understanding. She didn't rush the conversation. Instead, she shared her own experiences openly, talking about what it meant to live life behind the spotlight for so many years. Dolores described the pride of watching her son succeed, mixed with the loneliness of raising a family, while the world celebrated only the man on the court. She spoke about quiet sacrifices, late nights wondering if her husband would make it home, and the strength it took to keep the home warm, even when the attention was always somewhere else. Her words wrapped around Juanita like a comforting blanket, making her feel seen in a way no one else had managed during this painful time. For the first time in months, Juanita let herself breathe a little deeper and share some of the heaviness she had been carrying alone. After talking for a while, Dolores suggested they take a drive. They ended up at the peaceful cemetery where James was buried. The two women walked side by side along the quiet paths until they reached his grave. The air felt still and respectful, with soft sunlight filtering through the trees. Dolores stood there for a long moment, touching the stone gently before she began to speak. She revealed how James had carried his own worries about Michael's rising success. He had feared that the bright lights and constant demands would one day cost his son the most important thing, his family. James had seen the pull of fame and worried it might slowly pull Michael away from the people who loved him most. Hearing these family truths from Dolores brought fresh tears to Juanita's eyes. It helped her understand that the struggles in her marriage weren't just personal failures. They were part of a pattern that had worried even Michael's own father. Standing there together by the grave, Dolores turned to Juanita with honest, caring eyes. "You've been waiting at the finish line too long," she said softly but firmly. "Michael hasn't turned back." The words carried the weight of someone who had watched it all unfold over many years. Juanita's voice trembled as she asked the question that had been weighing on her heart for so long. "If I leave, am I abandoning him?" Dolores shook her head slowly and placed a gentle hand on Juanita's arm. "No. Leaving him is saving yourself." Those simple, powerful words brought both relief and sadness. They talked a little longer as the afternoon light began to fade, Dolores sharing more stories and encouragement that helped Juanita see her own worth and the importance of protecting her peace. On the quiet drive back, Juanita sat with everything she had heard. The visit to the grave and the heartfelt conversation with Dolores gave her a new sense of clarity, but it also stirred up many emotions. She decided not to reopen the divorce case, not yet. She wanted to give the reconciliation every honest chance before accepting that their marriage could no longer be saved. Part of her still cared deeply for Michael and the life they had shared, but another part recognized that she couldn't keep waiting forever. The wisdom from Dolores planted a quiet strength inside her, helping her imagine a future where she and the children could heal and move forward. As they pulled up to the house, Juanita thanked Dolores with a long hug, grateful for the guidance that felt like a turning point on her difficult path. The years that followed felt like one long, quiet farewell. Neither of them could quite bring themselves to finish. They tried one last time to hold on to what was left by creating Family Sundays, a ritual meant to bring them all back together. Juanita would plan simple things, meals the kids loved, games in the backyard, or just time to talk and laugh. She poured her hope into those days, believing that if they kept showing up for each other, something might heal. Michael promised he would be there. For a while, it almost felt like progress. But he was often late, walking through the door with tired eyes and apologies after the best parts of the afternoon had already passed. Juanita would greet him with a smile for the children's sake, but each time he arrived late, another small piece of her hope quietly slipped away. The kids would light up when he finally showed, but their excitement grew softer over time, as if they were learning not to get their hearts set too high. Slowly, the children stopped waiting. They no longer asked when Dad would arrive or saved the best seat for him at the table. Instead, they started eating without hesitation, filling their plates and sharing stories from their week like it was the most natural thing in the world. Juanita watched this change with a deep ache in her chest. She saw how her kids had gently closed off a part of their hearts to protect themselves from the repeated disappointment. They were still loving and kind, but they had learned to find joy in the moments they had, rather than holding their breath for someone who might not come. Those family Sundays, which were supposed to mend things, ended up showing just how wide the gap between them had grown. The laughter was still there, but it carried an undercurrent of acceptance that hurt Juanita more than any argument ever could. One quiet midnight, long after the house had gone still, Michael came and sat with her in the living room. The only light came from a small lamp, casting soft shadows around them. He looked exhausted, but there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "When did we lose each other?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with regret. Juanita sat with the question for a long moment, feeling all the years rise up inside her. When she finally spoke, her words came gently, but carried the full truth she had lived with for so long. "Not one day," she said softly. "Every dinner you missed, every word I swallowed, every time the children stopped looking for you." Her voice trembled slightly as she listed the small heartbreaks that had added up over the years. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She just needed him to understand how the silence and the absences had slowly pulled them apart until they became strangers sharing the same house. They sat together in the quiet for a long time after that, the midnight conversation laying bare everything they had avoided facing. Juanita felt both exhausted and strangely lighter, like naming the pain had finally given it somewhere to rest. Those years of unspoken farewell had been filled with small goodbyes, the late arrivals, the children learning to stop waiting, and the growing distance that no amount of family Sundays could bridge. In the end, the love they once shared hadn't disappeared in one dramatic moment. It had faded gradually, day by day, until what remained was the understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let go. Juanita looked at Michael with sad but peaceful eyes, knowing this long goodbye was leading them both toward something new. By Christmas 2006, the children were old enough to recognize the truth before either parent spoke it. Jeffrey was nearly grown. Marcus had learned to hide disappointment behind humor, and Jasmine was no longer the little girl who once waited for footsteps at the door. Still, when Michael and Juanita gathered them near the tree and explained that the marriage was truly ending, the finality of the words changed the room. Jasmine's eyes filled first. She asked whether the family might have stayed together if the children had needed less, complained less, or somehow made home easier to return to. Michael moved beside her and took both of her hands. He told her that none of the children had caused the separation and that the failure belonged only to the adults who had been unable to protect their marriage. Juanita watched father and daughter hold each other and felt grief for all the years when love had existed, but presence had not. That Christmas, Michael and Juanita made promises that would matter after the marriage ended. They would not speak against one another in front of the children. They would not make Jeffrey, Marcus, or Jasmine choose sides or carry messages between homes. They would not use gifts or money to replace time. Whatever had happened between husband and wife, they would remain parents to the same 3 children. The promises did not erase the pain, but they gave it boundaries. For the first time in years, Juanita felt that they were facing the ending together instead of disappearing from it in opposite directions. A few days later, she and Michael met at a small cafe. Their coffee cooled between them while they spoke about the life they had built, the snowy beginning, the small wedding, the championships, the children, and the thousands of ordinary moments that had slipped away. Michael asked whether she had ever truly been happy with him. Juanita thought of the young man who had once come for her in the snow, and the husband whose empty chair had eventually become part of the family. She told him that she had been happy, but that the happiness now felt like an old photograph, real, precious, and impossible to step back inside. They did not accuse each other. There was nothing left to win. They were simply 2 people who had loved deeply and arrived too late at the language that might once have saved them. When Juanita left the cafe, she carried sorrow, but she also carried peace. Their marriage was ending. Their family was not. Love had changed shape, and the work ahead was to let that new shape hold without asking it to become what it had once been. When Elena reached the final page of her notes, Juanita looked at the phone she had turned face down at the beginning of the interview. Michael had not called again. A voicemail waited beneath his name. Juanita listened in silence. His message was brief. Elena had told him the interview was happening, and he wanted Juanita to say what she needed to say. There was no request that she protect him, no attempt to rewrite the past. For the first time, his voice did not sound like a man preparing a defense. It sounded like someone finally willing to hear the score after the game was over. Elena then shared something she had held back. Weeks earlier, she had met Michael in an empty arena. Without the crowds, banners, or cameras, he had spoken about the cost of becoming the man the world celebrated. He understood now that championships had been built from hours that could never be returned, dinners missed, school nights passed on the road, small stories the children eventually stopped saving, and a woman who had carried the family while slowly disappearing inside the shadow of his greatness. Juanita listened with tears in her eyes. She did not feel victorious. Being proven right could not restore a childhood moment or reopen a door that had closed years before. But his understanding reached a place in her that had remained unfinished. She had wanted him to see, not so he would suffer, but so the life they had shared would no longer be remembered only through trophies. After Elena left, Juanita opened the wooden box. She removed the letter she had written after losing the baby and read it once more. Then she placed it in an envelope for Michael. She told him that she did not regret leaving. She regretted only that they had needed to lose each other before they learned how to see one another clearly. Several weeks later, they attended their grandson's youth basketball game. At first, they sat in different sections of the small gym. The room smelled of polished wood and popcorn, and the applause belonged not to a legend, but to children still learning how to dribble without looking at the ball. During intermission, Michael walked toward Juanita with the folded letter in his hand. His eyes were red. He sat beside her and admitted that he wished she had called him on the day she lost the baby. Juanita told him she wished she had called too. When he apologized that she had been alone, she took his hand, not as a wife returning to her husband, but as someone honoring the truth between two people who had once built a life together. They could not change yesterday, but that day, he was there. When the game resumed, their grandson drove toward the basket and sent the ball through the hoop. Michael and Juanita rose at the same moment. They clapped beside each other, their hands finding the same rhythm without effort. Juanita clapped until her palms stung, but this time she was not filling in for an absent father or trying to make an empty chair disappear. She was celebrating the child on the court, the family that had survived, and the woman she had become after learning that saving herself was not the same as abandoning love. Their grandson looked toward the stands and smiled when he saw them together. In the end, Juanita did not leave a man. She left the shadow that had made her disappear. Michael had won almost everything the world knew how to count, yet the greatest loss of his life had taken place quietly, in missed dinners, unanswered needs, and the gradual moment when his family learned to stop waiting. Years later, love returned in a different form, not as marriage, not as forgiveness that erased the past, but as presence. Two people standing side by side for the next generation, finally understanding that the smallest moments are often the ones a lifetime cannot replace.